Welcome to the Blockleaders podcast with me, Lisa Gibbons. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by David Schwed, the COO of Halborn Security. And we are delighted to talk all things security and trust in blockchains today. Thank you for being with me, David.
Thank you for having me.
Well, start from the start. How did you end up where you are today in the world of Web3?
Great question. I've had two different paths into Web3, one on a personal level and then one on a professional level. So on a personal level, I was always enamored with the technology, as purely as a technologist. At the time, it was around 2012, I did not think that we would enter this world of digital assets and Bitcoin being, priced where it was. But what really fascinated me with the technology was this concept of decentralized resiliency in some respect. That's really what piqued my interest of, not having this centralized authority, which from a risk perspective and from a security perspective could effectively bring down a piece of infrastructure. And I dove down the rabbit hole just again purely from a technological perspective, and that was around 2012. So I bought a couple of Bitcoin, not as much as I should have, just to send it back and forth and just look at the transactions from a cryptographic perspective. And always been a fan of the technology. And in 2018, I had exited a company that I had co-founded, and I was looking for my next opportunity. And a good friend of mine, who was also in Web3, was over at Galaxy Digital, and they were looking for a chief security officer at the time. And I got to marry the two things that I love the best: security, and then this new world of Web3. So professionally, I joined Galaxy in 2018 as their initial chief security officer, and it's been a ride since then.
Wonderful, wonderful. I love that you said the two passions of yours, security and the technology. What makes security attractive to you as a career choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I never really thought about that. Like, what's the ultimate drive here? And I think it's the challenge in some respect. It's not the same thing day in and day out. It's there's always this bar that's raising. As we put up more defenses, the bad guys are trying to figure out ways around the defensive. So each day looks a little bit different than the past. If you look at security, fundamentally, there's like two camps. There's the red teamers, the offensive people. How do I break into an organization? Then you have the blue teamers. How do I defend my organization from getting broken into? I like to align myself as a blue teamer. That's just where my mind works best. You have to understand the offensive strategies in order to put up the protect, but I like protecting organizations. And it's fun.
Yeah, and there's certainly plenty of protection needed today in the world we live in. So let's talk about blockchain. What are the principles around security in blockchain, and how do they differ from traditional security as you look at technology?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the space of Web3 security different than Web2 security, and the answer is fundamentally the core principles, and really boils down to how do you as an individual view security. And there's two different camps of security folks. There's the ones that are pure technologists that are just throwing, not in a bad way, but they attack the problem with technology. Let me throw a firewall. Let me throw data loss prevention. Let me throw CrowdStrike EDR. And then you have the camps of security people that are saying, well, at the end of the day, I'm just managing risk. It's a specific type of technological risk that I'm managing. And let me identify that risk. Let me look at my controls. Let me implement my controls. And are those controls effective? And if you look at it through that lens, security really isn't different. This is still technology. This is still code that's being run on machines. But I think the difference is responsiveness matters a little bit more in Web3. And traditionally in Web2, something flashes red on the screen, you investigate, eyes on glass, you open up a ticket, there's a forensic investigation, and maybe you can rectify it 4 to 8 hours later. In Web3, you can have $600 million walk out the door in a matter of 30 seconds. So I think it's about a paradigm shift in responsiveness is critical, or more critical than it was in Web2. And then the other piece too is more controls are needed, because because of the potential impact to an organization of money walking out the door. These are bearer assets. It's like robbing a bank. You're walking out with the gold. So instead of having one lock on the door, let me have 3 locks on the doors or 4 locks on the door. Let me have the security guard standing there, making sure that the locks are always locked. Let me have somebody standing past that security guard in case he gets shot by the robbers coming in to grab the gold. So it's more about more controls, assuming controls are going to fail, and then responsiveness. But the underlying principles of what we do as security professionals really hasn't changed.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually. The more I learn about the space, the more I kind of want to understand, and I want to understand more. Like you were saying, with the responsiveness being so critical, in the world of blockchain and Web3, I completely can see that from from all of the hacks and the stories that we've seen so far. So how does Halborn work specifically to with blockchains in regards to their security issues or their security needs?
Sure. There's a couple of ways. So first is like, what is our client profile, and then what are the scopes of work? We work, we can be DGen and friends, and then we can, work upscale in financial services, and be a little bit more buttoned up. So we understand the entire life cycle of Web3. And we work with Web3 native organizations. So we'll work with DEXs, we'll work with layer ones, and then we'll also work with some of the larger names, specifically in Web3. But then we'll also work with, your stuffy, banks, if you will. So we'll work with some of the largest global banks on their Web3 initiatives. And then as far as the scopes of services, we do traditional assurance work, meaning we'll do smart contract reviews, assessments. We'll do pen tests, we'll do, DevOps reviews. So we'll do your typical targeted focused assessments on particular infrastructures with the goal of delivering a report. And then we'll also work from an advisory capacity. So if we're working with an organization that is thinking about a custodial initiative, or they're thinking about staking, or they're thinking about interoperability from a payments rail perspective, we can work with them to think through what is some of the security challenges up front. We like to shift left in our thinking, build foundationally secure, as opposed to, okay, I built it, can you please come in and take a look at it before I go live? The earlier you can engage with a firm like Halborn or one of our peers, the better for any organization, because then you can build things foundationally more secure.
Yeah, and that's great. That's a really good point. Building from the bottom up, from when you're starting to think about the idea or the type of technology that you might want, then you engage with Halborn and have those initial discussions to get the expertise needed. And you mentioned smart contracts there. Like obviously, smart contracts are a very important component of the blockchain space and something that all of us in the Web3 space are familiar with. But for our viewers and for our listeners, people looking on the outside, maybe there's some companies that want to understand more about the vulnerabilities that can come alongside smart contracts or the risks associated with operating or managing smart contracts. Could you walk us through a little bit of that?
Sure, absolutely. So you could think of smart contract, like I mentioned before, it's just code, if you will, that's run on, and we take Ethereum, we'll use the term EVM, Ethereum virtual machine. So it's run on this decentralized global computer, and you're running code. The challenges come in a couple of different facets. The first is, what is the code doing? And we're talking about managing these bare assets. So you have this automated code that is touching this asset that has an intrinsic value to it. And when you do things like a bridge, for example, that's the easiest way to talk about, potential vulnerability. So a bridge is, I have one ecosystem, I have Ethereum, and I have another ecosystem, say Solana, and I have assets on one, and I want to move them over to another one. So that's why we use the term bridge. So it's bridging the assets from one. Now, the problem is the native assets in one don't work on the other particular ecosystem. So when we bridge, we're effectively locking up an asset here, and then we're releasing assets on this ecosystem. So all of that is done via this code. So if I am a malicious, individual, I know that there's assets locked up in smart contracts. I know that there's a contract or code over here that waits for some sort of messaging coming from over here to say, okay, I've locked up, you can now release over here. So if I can find some vulnerabilities, and it's not vulnerabilities necessarily like in the underlying code itself, it's usually in the business logic. So if we can look through the business logic and say, this doesn't check to make sure that it's locked up before it releases, so then I can, have this infinity, money glitch hack where I can just keep, printing more money. So what happens is, the beauty of Web3 is the transparency, the openness. So the code is available to everybody. So they can, eyes on glass, the bad guys can look through the code and look for that business logic vulnerability, and then they can go to exploit it. So the smart contract, again, is just code. The problem is the code is visible to everybody, and the potential yield is so high that you have the best hackers in the world that are looking through this code. And the other challenge to point out here is, since Web3 is somewhat of still of a new industry, there's not a lot of industry best practices or frameworks per se. So you're getting a lot of, I don't want to use the word young, but more of it's a relatively new technology. So we don't have people that have been doing this for the last 20, 30, 40 years, and best practices of static and dynamic code analysis tools that we see in traditional coding. So, you're coupling it with people without true level enterprise experience, organizations that are relatively, not well funded. They just got their seed check, so they hire one or two developers. You don't have a team of thousands of cybersecurity professionals that a bank does. So it's a perfect storm of the best threat actors, somewhat little funding and new projects that are getting stood up with people with maybe not deep level technical expertise, which is why we're seeing a lot of these vulnerabilities in the code.
Yeah, and you can see just from the explanation that you gave there, you can see why it would be attractive to potential hackers and potential people that can see this massive opportunity or this massive gap in security that's required, and the security that we're very familiar with in Web 2. I suppose from my point of view, when we first initially spoke, we spoke about the importance of education as we encourage adoption in this space and encourage more people to get involved and build projects and build products and use cryptocurrencies and blockchains for good. How do we, in your mind, how do we encourage more education, and how do we prevent people from being like retailers specifically from being vulnerable from the first instance as they get in, because it's definitely a way of them saying, okay, I'm in and now I'm running away again.
Yes. It's a great question, and I wish I had like the perfect answer. I think it's a combination of a few different things. One is the adoption of frameworks and the adoption of different initiatives. There's a great, and I don't normally like mentioning organizations, but this one is a nonprofit, so I feel comfortable. It's Crypto Consortium. Crypto Consortium's mission is to really educate both the retail and as well as provide frameworks for organizations. So more initiatives like the Crypto Consortium coming in to educate retail as well as help create standards in certain areas. So they came out with a standard for custody, which is being adopted by many custodians. So I think, nonprofits, I think there's a lot of opportunity for different credentialing, like we have in traditional cybersecurity. We have CISSP from ISC squared, equivalent with that same level of respect in the industry that ISC squared has, or ISACA has as well, coming out. And I think it's also just the responsibility of organizations to upskill their staff. If you have somebody who's a Web 2 individual, there are ways to train them, unfortunately, not through a regimented curriculum per se, but organizations can create their own training curriculum as well as creating labs. So I think it's about the industry itself coming up with a solution on how to educate masses as well as coming up with the services and frameworks. Universities as well, I think, is another opportunity. Again, not to put on my marketing hat, but if I'm a university at the moment, this is one of the hottest fields right now. Whether it's creating a degree specifically or a concentration or a boot camp, specifically around blockchain security. I see a lot of initiatives on blockchain developing and blockchain programming, but I haven't really seen from universities a real strong focus on blockchain security. So I think from a marketing perspective, I think a lot of universities can jump on this, this wave and create something specific to this.
Yeah, and great idea. I know we had mentioned it in our previous conversations as well, having maybe a train the trainer program where there's like training there's obviously teachers and lecturers in universities that have an interest in the technology and might be very capable of standing up in front of a lecture room and presenting to students, but they mightn't be so comfortable in the arena of security specifically. So I think Halborn and your peers and companies like yours play a very important role in providing that that level of expertise. Yes. Or the guidance that's required there, because there's a difference between being a presenter and being the knowledge expert like you guys are.
And that's a really great point. The industry, the other thing that I love about Web3 is everybody's so open and willing to help that, I can tell you right now, if you reached out to any one of my, peers or colleagues, either within Halborn or, some of our peers or competitors or just other security folks in the space, they would happily donate their time to, as you eloquently mentioned, train the trainer. So I think that's a great idea.
Super. Well, we get on that. That'll be the next.
Okay, let's do it.
After this podcast, we're going to do a train the trainer series. So for the juicy stuff, I have to ask you about any. Can you give us any stories or any hacking incidents that would shock you or shock security experts in the Web 2 world, but also I suppose, provide a little snippet of what's out there and the potential, I suppose, way of helping people understand the vulnerabilities and the risks associated with blockchains now?
Sure, absolutely. There's one that I always love talking about, and it's the Axie Infinity hack. And I think people get hung up on the amount, but not actually what happened. And I think it's a not just for Web3, but also for Web2 individuals to understand the type of attack vector that happened. And forget the technical side of the hack. That is definitely interesting. But what I like talking about is the social engineering aspect of it, because when we get trained in I've been guilty of it as well. When you're in corporate and you go through your phishing exercises, it's always don't click on an email. Don't click on this link in an email that asks you to reset your password for your Microsoft Office. Yes, those are phishing attempts that are being sent out. Those are usually like, just a shotgun approach. Let me just send these out and hope someone clicks on it. But when we start focusing on these targeted social engineering attempts, that's when things get really interesting. And I think if people understood what happened on the Axie Infinity side, it's a really interesting story. So what happened was the hacking group, which was later found out to be the Lazarus Group, which was associated with North Korea. They created on LinkedIn a fake recruiting profile for Coinbase. And they took the time to build out this profile, have a whole job history, recommendations. They connected with, I think, hundreds of people at Coinbase, as well as other peer Web3 organizations. So anybody, including myself, that would be looking at this LinkedIn profile, it looks legitimate. It's been around for months, if not years, because again, sometimes they have dormant accounts that they use, that they've created and just hold on to for validity purposes. Connected with people at Coinbase, have a job history, everything, education, there's a picture, looks real. Nothing that anybody can do to determine that this was not real just from looking at it. So what they did was they reached out to a developer at the organization, Sky Mavis, which was the developer for Axie Infinity. They reach out to them and they say, we're looking for somebody to come in and manage our blockchain engineering group. Person responded on LinkedIn and said, that sounds very interesting. I'd like to apply. They had them apply. They set up interviews. It was either 3 or 5 interviews. I forget the number. They had a Zoom interview. They interviewed this individual, and this all was over the course of a couple of weeks. It wasn't within 24 hours. Then after they went through the interviews, they gave it a week or two, reached back out. You're a final candidate. We wanted to talk to you about an offer. Schedule another meeting now with an HR individual. Walk through the entire thing. Here's your offer. Health benefits, salary. Person accepted. Great. We're going to send you a job offer letter. Said, fantastic. And that was a PDF that was infected, which took over that machine. So that entire exercise was the Lazarus Group trying to get this individual to open up a file. So, I mean, just if you think about that level of effort to go through in order to trick somebody to sign, and you start thinking through, well, they're willing to do things like that, what are some other attack vectors? And we just talked about, conferences. Conferences for me are, such an easy picking ground. If I wanted to own a particular project, number one, I know everybody there at these conferences are generally going to be founders trying to pitch their products. I could follow them back to their hotels. I could, while the conference is ongoing, pay, one of the cleaning staff, $500 to get access to the room. I could very easily open a safe. I can put listening devices. I mean, this is all things that sound far-fetched, but if I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of potential yield, that $500 effort, plane ticket out to a particular location is worth it. So these things are happening. So it's also about operational security. It's just as important.
Amazing. I can't believe the effort that they go to get it. It's incredible. And speaking about effort, I was looking at, I think we spoke about this in previous conversations as well, the white hat hackers who actually hack into systems to assess the vulnerabilities. And based on what I'm seeing online via social medias and some reports and stuff, there's still a lot of vulnerability in some of the most used applications and protocols in the Web3 space. So why is that, and how can we manage those expectations again of people coming into the space, understanding it and wanting the space to be better and to promote it more easily, and we're still seeing those vulnerabilities in the very, very important platforms that we're using every week, every day.
Yeah, it's a good question. The first thing I want to say is, expectation wise, this isn't a problem that's unique to Web3. I mean, we see SolarWinds, we'll see Microsoft, we'll see Cloudflare, Microsoft patches, their operating systems, repeatedly because there's always new vulnerabilities that are discovered. So the first thing is this is not a problem that's unique to Web3. The problem is we see it more because it results in immediate theft. So I think it's also a mind shift when you're looking at a project. You should always look at a project and assume that there's going to be vulnerabilities. So when you assume there's going to be vulnerabilities, you take a different approach when you're securing your project. I'm going to assume that someone's going to be able to break into my firewall. I'll have somebody, some devices that are scanning for traffic, look for traffic, breaking through the firewall. So it's about setting up and not relying on a specific control. But I think the other issue is I think there's somewhat of like this bystander effect of because things are open source, that it's secure because we can see the code. And the exercise I like to ask everybody who has that mentality is like, have you personally audited the code? And they're like, well, no. I go, well, then you're just assuming and relying that somebody else is doing it for you. You can't do that. And there's this feeling of if something's open source, we can trust it more. And if it's closed, I can't. From a security perspective, yes, there's this, you can have access to the code and you can do your own auditing. The problem is that now, as I mentioned before, if you can see the code, you have a much deeper understanding of the code and being able to look for certain vulnerabilities. If something is closed and you're only looking at compiled code, you can run certain tests on it as a as a bad actor, as well as a good actor, but you don't get to see the underlying code. So it's like black box. It's a little bit more difficult to look for those vulnerabilities. So I'm not advocating that close is better than open, open's better than closed, but don't fall into the trap of making this assumption that, somebody else is looking at the code because it's open source. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge that I don't think it's ever going to get fixed either on the Web 2 or the Web 3 side. So it's our responsibility as a cybersecurity professionals is to that defense in depth and multiple layers of controls.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a big responsibility you have there, David. But the transparency thing is interesting to me as well because it's something I've written about over the last few years, being in this space about 5 years, writing for 4 or 5 years and learning at the same time as writing about it. And transparency and immutability, they're two terms that come up all the time, and I tend to associate them with a lot of projects. A lot of projects pick them out as key features or key benefits of blockchain technology. But there is then the other side of the privacy and the confidentiality, so where I suppose my question is, they're features, but in this space, do they always need to be key benefits, or can we? I know ZK proof, there's some new technology and sharding as well. Do we need to manage the privacy side of things a bit better from the blockchain world?
Yeah, it's funny. There's always this debate of permission versus permissionless, and I think the answer is going to be both. There's use cases for permissioned and there's use cases for permissionless. If we look at the use case for permissioned, and what permission gives us is, this, yes, it's immutable, but we can reverse transactions. And when you say that, you have your degen and friends and ETH heads and maxis will lose their collective shit if you say things like reversibility. But the answer is like there are safeguards and ways to do things in a certain manner that if you want to reverse a transaction and require cryptographically certain things to happen in order to reverse a transaction. And where would you do that? If you're looking at things like there's something called the RLN, which is the Regulated Liability Network, which is a replacement for financial market infrastructure or financial institutions when you're talking about sending payments and settlement. Now that's an area where we can leverage digital ledger technology. We can leverage the transparency, the cryptographic immutability of transactions. We'll create mechanisms where we can recall a wire or recall something if we need to. But now we can create a mechanism where I don't know, 5 out of 9 counterparties have to agree to recall the wire. And now we have transparency. We have who requested it. We have who approved it. It's on the chain. We can see it. So we can still create mechanisms to reverse transactions, if you will, or force a transaction to send funds back, but do it in a way that's programmable and that it's auditable and it's attestable. So I think if we look and look at that through that lens, I think it's not such a bad thing to have that. But on the other side, I completely understand, if we're talking about an open, financial network, and DEXs, we can have a mechanism where transactions are reversed, so that the immutability is key in that respect. And when it comes down to privacy, everything by design is private in the sense where I don't know who the counterparty is. The problem is you can still, because of the transparency, trace transactions. So you can see, where transactions may be potentially originated from. And there is some techniques and mechanisms to say, this wallet is associated with this whale, and we can kind of watch the sending and piece things back together. So there is some danger in that, because you can, through certain market movements or announcements, we're talking about FTX, and if there's some sort of disbursements from the bankruptcy, and now we can watch hundreds of Sol tokens or whatever, the millions of Sol tokens, we can kind of now associate that. So there is some danger from a privacy perspective of watching these flow of funds. So I don't think that's been necessarily solved, because the only way to really solve that is either through like Monero or Zcash, which will never pass AML compliance, or if we start using tumblers. In that case, a tumbler obviously is a way to enforce privacy, but it's also associated with money laundering. So I don't think there's a great answer per se from a privacy perspective, but there's definitely mechanisms for anonymity, because we don't necessarily know who the wallet address is.
Yeah, and I'm in one hand, I'm like, oh, this is great, and it's really out there, and we can see all these wallets and these movements of transactions. On the other hand, it can be very frustrating, Can imagine getting hacked, and then you're following the wallet around, and you don't know who it is, and you can't get at the person. But yeah, I like the idea of the reverse transactions for certain instances. If there's like a large corporation decide to get involved in this space, and there's a lot of their reputation, their corporate structure, their partnerships, their B2B relationships on the line, then I think there has to be some kind of insurance there, and that they can get money if it's taken. And also, it's using the security knowledge that we have in the Web2 space that we've built up over time, like the banks. Okay, you have 3 transactions, and there's an alarm system sent out to say, okay, these are transactions that doesn't appear right. You have 3 transactions in the last 2 seconds, taking all your money. And I think that should apply to the Web3 protocols and exchanges and the stuff that we see today as well. Those alarm systems. Can you share some incidences maybe as well of not the breaches, but ways in which that Halborn have kind of worked with partners or with your clients to ensure that the security is in place? I'm thinking mostly, I suppose, from the startup projects in the space. We're just getting in and just thinking about auditing, for example.
Sure. Yeah, the best way to work with a company like Halborn is, we have something called like a security advisory as a service. So organizations and startups will work with us, and it's not just, come in and do a smart contract assessment. There are multiple different types of engagement. So they'll engage with us over a 6 or a 12-month period where it's, okay, help us from an advisory capacity, think about how we're going to do blank. Okay, we just developed this smart contract. We're going to engage with Halborn to do a smart contract assessment of the code. Now we're looking at our DevOps. How does that code make its way into production? So we'll look at that, CI/CD plumbing, if you will, that pipeline from development to production. Now we have a web front end, so we'll do a pen test for them, to make sure that the web front end is protected, because that's another mechanism in which hackers can replace a wallet address on the front end and just completely, not have to worry about, changing anything on the back end. And then, we'll also help them. I mentioned before, like there's, some best practices or standards. So, make sure we're aligning with, for example, the crypto consortium's, custody standards. So let's look through our custody strategy. So it's really like looking at the entire life cycle of a transaction, and also from a development perspective. And we can have services that help organizations along that entire life cycle and help them to make sure, from development into production and post deployment, that they're protected.
That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of a timeline then for the startup, if they're watching us today now and they're thinking, oh yeah, well, I was going to have a project and I thought I could launch it tomorrow without any audits or without any checks and balances. Is there a timeline that you would suggest to them to be thinking about this stuff?
Yeah, and I'm not saying this from a sales capacity. It's earlier the better. It's frustrating for me as a cybersecurity professional and a lover of this technology when we'll get a call on a Monday. Hey, we are going live next Monday, so you need to do the audit in a week. And the answer is, number one, we most likely don't have resources available. And 2, you shouldn't be dictating to a security company when you're going live, because what if we find a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities? And there are practices where projects will go live while they're fixing things because they want to meet their marketing and they want to meet their biz dev. So there's a lot of, let me just kind of, brush off the table, as people are walking into the restaurant, type of thing, where that's not the proper way to do that. If you borrow, what is done in banking, and again, I'm not saying banking is the best way to do it because they're notoriously slow and not necessarily innovators. There's a lot that goes into reviewing a project before they flip the switch and say this is live, because we're talking reputation. If you have a project that goes live on a Monday and there's a hack on a Tuesday, your funding's dried up, you're not getting your next round, and you just lost all of your, TVL and your users are gone. You need to make sure you're doing things properly. So I would say engage as early as possible, because there may be things, we're the experts and our peers are the experts. There may be things you're not thinking of. We typically are engaged like that security advisory as a service, but there are folks that come in, a la carte and say, I just need you to do a smart contract assessment. And the questions that I, pose to them just as, goodwill is, okay, what are you doing for custody? Where about those keys that are signing these contracts? Where is the treasury located? What is your processes around treasury? What does your structure look like from a security perspective? Can you get social engineered just like they did at Axie Infinity? You can't just focus on the smart contracts, because I understand from a marketing perspective, that's what they want to display out to the ecosystem. Hey, we just got reviewed. Our smart contract is safe. But if the rest of your security, isn't good, there's going to be other breaches. So I would say as early as possible to engage with a security firm.
Okay, super. And you can go talk to David directly. Inbox will be busy now, David. I'm really pleased to be having these conversations, and pleased to have you on the Blockleaders podcast today, because I think it's an important discussion. I think education is a key component. So the more educators we have, like yourself, that can very easily break down the different components of security required, then I think it would make it tangible for people who are looking in and starting off. Everyone in the space as well seems to want to have has it in them to start some type of project or be part of an ecosystem to help an ecosystem grow. And I think in that sense, everyone needs to understand these different sides.
Yeah, and what the message I would say to everybody is, there are certain key people and skill sets that they loop in, but sometimes security is thought of, let me bring it in afterwards. It's like if you're going for funding for a new project, in a million years, you're not going to engage with a law firm, right? You're going to engage with a law firm to draw up your documents. Why would you not engage with a cybersecurity firm or professional when you're building something out? Too many times it's, let me grab my CTO who's a developer. It's technical, so I'm sure he's good at security or she's good at security. And it's two different skill sets. A security person is not a CTO, and a CTO is not. That's why we have CTOs, and that's why we have CISOs. Different skill sets. Just because they're both technical doesn't mean you can conflate the two. So I would say security is as important as everything else you're doing when you're doing your startup, and to really think that through. Because it could also be a differentiator from a marketing perspective. Go with my project because we take security more seriously than our competitors.
Absolutely. You can trust us because we invested the time. Yeah, agreed. And in terms of the working alongside the authorities as well, I know, that I've been speaking to some of the authorities here in Ireland and the UK recently. And like you said, the responsiveness would kind of worry me a little bit, because they're not as clued into advanced technologies, even the languages used, Substrate and all these new languages used in the realm of Web3. So how do we help them to come up to speed and get up to speed in what's happening in the space? Great.
I'm glad you brought this up. The first thing is we need to mature. Number one, as a community, we need to stop yelling at regulators on X or Twitter. We're not creating a very conducive working relationship when we're completely trashing regulators. There's no other industry that I've seen that is as vehemently vocal against regulators openly on Twitter. You can be frustrated, and there's vehicles and mechanisms in order to voice your frustrations in a productive manner towards regulators. But if I'm, in the US, if I'm the SEC or any of the other regulators, I'm not necessarily going to feel like I can trust and reach out to private and have conversations, because the second that conversation's done, someone's going to go online and say, listen to this stupid question I was just asked by the SEC. So I think number one, we need to mature and we need to want to work with regulators and want to educate and want to, uplift them. I've done my part in that, through different lenses, and I've done some trainings for, different regulators to help them think through the technology. So I think as a ecosystem, we need to change the way that we view regulators. They're here to protect. They're not here to prevent. And the only reason they're preventing is because they feel that their consumers are not protected. And if we look at it through that lens, it's, well, let me put myself in their shoes and understand there's hacks like daily, every single day. So how are we yelling at the regulators that they this type of technology when there are, people every day that are losing millions of dollars? So maybe they're not wrong in some respect. Maybe we should listen to them and work with them to create these types of frameworks and to do the training. So I think there's a lot that needs to happen on both sides, but I think we as an industry need to grow up a little in some respect.
That's fantastic. And here to protect, not to prevent. I love that. I'm taking that one. That's probably the title of our next article around the security space. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me, David. Is there any, just for a last piece of advice to people, startups in particular, that are looking to get into the space? If you had one piece of advice for them, that would be a final call out. I would be delighted.
Yeah, what I would say is reach out to people that have been in the space. It doesn't even need to be like a paid engagement. I am more than happy, and I do it daily, is I will spend half hour sitting with a project and giving them advice, direction, and I'll tell them, check in with me once a month, not asking for anything from a compensatory perspective. It's selfishly, I want the technology to succeed, and I know myself and others in my seat that have the experience are more than happy to give back. So don't feel that you can't reach out to others in the industry and look for that mentorship or look for that advice. We're here to help. So just send out that email and ask for that meeting, and guarantee you 9 out of 10 times somebody will say yes.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being on the Blockleaders podcast today, David. Lovely to have you.
Yes, thank you for having me.